Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents The Ethical Stripper, Sex, Work and Labour Rights in the Nighttime Economy. By Stacey Clare. Narrated by Stacey Clare.
Introduction. Many of my colleagues and customers over the years will testify that this book is long overdue. In fact, after listening to me lamenting on the injustices of a business model that forces women to tolerate appalling abuses and acts of discrimination on a regular basis, more than a few of them have suggested it to me. Usually, while I'm at work, sitting on a bar stool in stripper garb and high heels, pontificating on my lack of employment rights on a slow day shift in an East London strip joint. Blimey, Stacey, you should write a book, they say. I'm going to, I say. What happened instead was a decade of surviving in London, one of the most expensive cities in the Western capitalist world, while at the same time trying to be an effective activist before I could get anywhere close to having the resources I needed to start writing. During this time, I watched my industry slowly and steadily disintegrate as economic, cultural and political conditions repeatedly undermined the women working in it. This is a book about labour rights. As much as I'm writing with my own community in mind, this book also aims to reach a wider audience who are unaware of the complex realities of sex work. As we move into a stridently feminist post-Me Too era, conversations about the sex industry are more frequent and wide-reaching than ever. The mission of the sex workers' rights movement is harm reduction, a concept I'll explore throughout this book. And our challenge is building a critical mass of allies and supporters who are able to deliver the essential information so crucial to our efforts. Considering the centuries of criminalisation, censorship, shaming, violence, marginalisation, silencing, and state-sanctioned brutality of sex workers, this is no mean feat. Public discourse has been dominated by morality and prejudice for so long that the work of disseminating information isn't just a matter of simply sharing data. The real task lies in breaking down the historical barriers that have prevented key expertise in language developed by generations of committed sex working activists from being shared with well-meaning potential allies, a problem that I hope this book, at least in parts, may help remedy. At times, it seems to me that activism in general is a lot like needlework. Patient, slow, diligent and persistent, progress is barely perceptible and reveals itself over time. As an advocate, I'm required to patiently unpick the tightly woven social fabric of stigma, which is slow and tedious work indeed. Like our great-great-great-grandmothers of first-wave feminism, who objected to sitting in quiet composure over their needlework, behaving like good little women, our instinct is to set fire to the hegemonic tapestries woven from centuries of underpaid and undervalued women's work. There isn't time for patience, though. For transgender sex workers, for Black Indigenous people of colour, for undocumented, street-based sex workers, for the most vulnerable members of the sex industry who have no access to state protections or legal resources, differences between legal regimes and policies can mean life, survival or death. It can mean targeted police oppression, loss of income, poverty and destitution, children separated from caregivers, migrant incarceration and deportation. There isn't time to do the required amount of emotional labour for sex workers to carefully and tenderly hold space while the rest of society processes their internalised discomfort and unease, one conversation at a time, stitch by stitch. To quote Juno Mack and Molly Smith, sex workers and authors of the hugely authoritative book Revolting Prostitutes, it is not the task of sex workers to apologise for what prostitution is. Sex workers should not have to defend the sex industry to argue that we deserve the ability to earn a living without punishment. People should not have to demonstrate that their work has intrinsic value to society to deserve safety at work. A stripper writing an autobiography isn't groundbreaking these days, and those wishing to read about the emotional rollercoaster of working in a strip club in vivid detail are spoiled for choice. Lap dancing was big business at the turn of the 21st century, and public fascination for those who disrobe for money hasn't shown any signs of abating since then, although the actual marketplace has changed considerably. It stands to reason that plenty of strippers have cashed in on their own experiences by publishing their memoirs. There have been so many stripper autobiographies in the last 20 years that they are virtually a subgenre in their own right, and glancing through some of the titles is practically a form of entertainment. Girl Undressed, Ruth Fowler, 2009. The Beaver Show, Jacqueline Francis, 2015. Strip City, A Stripper's Farewell Journey Across America, Lily Burana, 2003. Spent, Antonia Crane, 2017. 2 Decades Naked, Lee Hopkinson, 2016. Candy Girl, A Year in the Life of an Unlikely Stripper, Diablo Cody, 2005. Bear, The Naked Truth About Stripping, Elizabeth Eves, 2004. The Stripper Next Door, Emma Lee Corbett, 2018. Stripping Down, A Memoir, Sheila Hageman, 2012. Anything But a Wasted Life, Sita Kalin, 2018. Dirty Money, Memoirs of a Stripper, Erin Louis, 2015. Dr. Brooke Bagnanti is probably the most widely recognised author of the genre, whose Intimate Confessions of a London Call Girl, 2005, became an international bestseller. Her pen name, Belle de Jour, has become synonymous with the contemporary erotic biography. Thanks to the success of the series, which was eventually turned into a primetime BBC TV show, Belle de Jour is verging on a household name. Magnanti's achievement has given rise to a cornucopia of copycat writers replicating the format of sex industry kiss-and-tell exposés over and over again. Public appetites for sex worker stories are understandable. For the consuming public, it's all just a bit of fun, a titillating distraction from ordinary life, right? Maybe. But for sex workers, there is a far more serious edge to it. The problem arises when fiction is confused with reality, when narratives presented in popular culture are assimilated as fact. If films, TV shows, and tabloid articles inform wider beliefs about sex work, a void opens up between fantasy and reality, into which empirical data and evidence-based research are lost, making information increasingly difficult to share. Mainstream narratives shape public opinion in ways that can't be underestimated, and when the desire to consume is greater than the thirst for knowledge, then we have a cultural imbalance that is hard to rectify. The urge to consume and the urge to tell all complete each other, like the Ouroboros, the symbolic snake eating its own tail. I could easily contribute to the cycle. I could have written a book revealing more personal details about my childhood neglect and dysfunctional upbringing, financial struggles, disastrous relationships, and occasional substance use. It's tempting to lift the lid on all the painful realities and the joys, the friendships, the glamour, the highlights and intensity, the emotional roller coaster. But as a writer, I wanted to use this book to make a contribution towards harm reduction and sex workers' rights by disseminating information, knowledge, and insight, rather than dishing the dirt. My story, like my body, is my own business. Another greatly overrepresented subgenre in publishing is the academic study of the sex industry. Since third-wave feminism in the 1970s sought to eradicate the sex industry, vast numbers of academic books and papers have been written by non-sex workers that take a pedagogic approach and have proven no less popular than sex workers' autobiographies. However, academic researchers have tended to take up opposing sides of an argument for and against the sex industry, ingraining divisions between sex-positive, pro-sex work feminists who seek to empower sex workers by removing the burden of criminalization on one side, and on the other, sex industry abolitionist, carceral feminists, also known as sex worker exclusionary radical feminists, or SWERFs, who aim to end the sex trade by imposing and increasing state penalties and restrictions. The sex wars are now rumbling along into their 5th decade. And while the two camps battle it out, with prominent mainstream feminists locked in conflict, creating another repetitive cycle, sex workers' voices are repeatedly ignored. Mercifully, more recent titles have been written by sex workers themselves, propounding a more circumspect view concentrated on safety and harm reduction rather than a sex-positive interpretation of sex work. This book contains the apparatus of scholarly references, but it's not an academic publication. And while there are personal anecdotes throughout, it's not an autobiography either. I have chosen to write from two perspectives woven together, two voices speaking alongside each other to reflect my two personas. Stacey, the stripper, the worker, the slut, and Claire, the researcher, the ideologist. Since I first began stripping as a plucky art student, I have been seeking to reconcile my personal experience with the variety of opinions, voices, beliefs, and feminist narratives around me. I found one of the best ways to do this has been to divide myself, for the sake of brevity, creating at least two different identities to allow for different and occasionally opposing ideologies to coexist while I process and integrate them. The term sex positive has started to become an unhelpful phrase within sex worker activist circles. Increasingly, sex positivity has been entering the mainstream consciousness as an enlightened and empowered attitude to sexuality. The sex positive ethos is that sex is nothing to be ashamed of, and sex-positive people are healthier and happier for exploring their sexual proclivities safely and consensually. Sex work doesn't necessarily sit comfortably in this framework. If sex is only positive as long as it's safe and consensual, then in practice, many sex workers, whose work may be unsafe or whose consent may be undermined by circumstance, are left behind. Sex workers who enjoy high levels of privilege and consent may often identify with sex positivity to leverage further benefits and freedoms, which is how we arrive at the term happy hooker. The sex-positive movement may celebrate sex work as an enlightening and meaningful activity, but this can be confusing if the lived experience of other sex workers is less than positive. There isn't much room for sex positivity for survival sex workers, for instance. Readers of this book may be more familiar with the term harm reduction in the context of public health and addiction, but perhaps not so much in relation to the sex industry. There are many clear comparisons to be made between decriminalisation of drugs and decriminalisation of sex work, since they both fall within a public health remit. The war on drugs has been entirely counterproductive and has shown how criminalisation of substances has exacerbated the social conditions that increase vulnerability and addiction. Evidence from around 30 countries that have adopted some form of decriminalisation shows very clearly that there are improved social outcomes from shifting public policy away from criminalisation. This is what harm reduction looks like: evidence-based strategies that have positive results. Since the evidence shows that criminalisation does not lead to safety and harm reduction, and that criminalised marketplaces are in fact the most violent and coercive marketplaces that exist, this book is therefore written from a position that supports the full decriminalisation of sex work. Throughout the book, I use the terms stripper, lap dancer, and sex workers interchangeably, since to many of us they mean the same thing. It's important to acknowledge that the term sex worker applies to anyone who provides sexual services: strippers, lap dancers, full-service sex workers, escorts, prostitutes, porn performers, webcammers, pro-doms, hostesses, glamour models, tantric practitioners, somatic sex therapists. Essentially, anyone trading on their erotic capital and performing sexual labour is a sex worker. As a group, we are all marginalised, and the reason I use the term is to build solidarity and challenge the stigma that unites everyone in the sex industry, no matter their job. When I identify myself as a sex worker, I draw heavily on my experience as a stripper, having danced in strip clubs since 2006. I have also looked closely at licensing legislation in the UK, and since this is my greatest area of knowledge and research, I've been acting as an advocate for sex industry workers who work in licensed premises, i.e. sexual entertainment venues, or SEVs. While the distinctions between stripping and full-service sex work and their various crossovers will be explored throughout by focusing in on UK strip clubs as a subsection of the wider sex industry. I hope to contribute in part towards a broader discussion of sex work policy. The legislative distinctions between stripping and full-service sex work are widely misunderstood. Stripping is legalised in the UK, for now, via the SEV licensing regime, while prostitution is criminalised in a number of ways. Criminalisation means full-service sex work must happen in secrecy, behind closed doors, while strip clubs can legally operate in publicly licensed premises. Practically speaking, this means that strippers can still organise and campaign for their rights within the workplace, while full-service sex workers cannot access labour rights since they do not have a workplace. Any spaces where full-service sex work takes place in any kind of organised way are criminalised. By explaining these differences, it is not my intention to be divisive. Rather, I hope to demystify a lot of the confusing rules and policy decisions that keep some kinds of sex work more marginalised than others. One of the objections from fellow sex workers to the chosen title of this book is that claiming to be an ethical stripper sets up a dichotomy, with the suggestion that some strippers are more ethical than others. This has never been the intended meaning behind the title of this book, which is written in the spirit of solidarity with other sex workers who are all too familiar with finding themselves on the wrong side of a mainstream moral binary. Such a binary reiterates the age-old trope that women who sell sex or sexual services are bad women. The very last thing I want to do is create further divides by suggesting that some sex workers are good in that they behave properly and follow the rules, while others are transgressive or immoral. For this reason, I have chosen the term ethical, where the ethical proposition is harm reduction. It is not my intention to judge anyone's personal choices, but to focus on how suffering can be reduced at a systemic level through collaboration and mutual support. In my experience, this is something to which sex workers are already fully signed up, successfully organising to a degree that is nothing short of inspiring. Throughout the writing of this book, I have been navigating a considerable fear as an author that my words do not serve everyone in my community. I have agonised for months, not just over vocabulary and syntax, but also about representation and advocacy. What right do I have to speak on behalf of other sex workers? As a white, British-born, English-speaking, educated, cis female with access to power, justice and resources, I enjoy certain forms of privilege and comfort, as well as a public-facing role as a writer and media spokesperson. But my relative privilege hasn't made me impervious to adversity as a sex worker. The violence, toxicity, coercion, bullying, victimization, and trauma experienced by people in the sex industry are real. I'm also a survivor. There are countless vulnerable people in the sex industry who cannot access resources or self-advocate for so many reasons. And the challenge for anyone involved in activism is knowing how to share their platform and privilege with underrepresented and at-risk groups. The fear for every sex worker who puts their head above the parapet and enters the world of activism and advocacy is they may get it wrong, as they often do. I hope that I have not failed my colleagues who operate further out in the margins. Perhaps to the disappointment of some, this book falls into traditional patterns of heteronormative language. Sadly, I don't think I can safely and carefully represent more marginalised LGBTQI+ and Black, Indigenous, people of colour groups who are underrepresented in this publication. For this I apologise. To my own disappointment, this is a reflection of their underrepresentation within the strip club industry in its present form. There is still much work to be done before strip clubs can offer less misogynistic and more egalitarian spaces where all genders and identities can enjoy equal freedom and visibility. Incredibly, in July 2019, during the writing of this book, the first queer strip club in the UK, Harpies, opened the doors of their London venue, marking a hugely positive shift in that direction. While I have referenced the work of many incredible authors and activists, this book is still polemical. I am a sex worker, and this is my version of events as I see them. The pitfalls of writing about my own experience as well as advocating on behalf of those who don't necessarily share it, are innumerable. This book may be difficult and uncomfortable to read for others in the same field of work, if my story doesn't chime with theirs. There are untold sex workers whose experiences do not match my own, since the full range of issues of class, gender, age, immigration, ethnicity, ability, disability, and economic disparity to be found in the global sex industry go a long way beyond what I have encountered. I cannot claim to represent all members of the sex industry. Mine is one voice among many, and my greatest privilege of all is having a podium, no pun intended, to speak for myself. There is occasional mention throughout this book of rumours and hearsay among strippers and sex workers, although I never divulge anything more than a vague reference to internal dialogue. I cannot say where these rumours come from, since quoting their sources would jeopardise strippers and sex workers' private networks. These forums are often carefully screened and curated, and have become essential resources for sex workers to share knowledge and information for staying safe. Therefore, one of the caveats of this book is that I am asking readers to respect our need for privacy and trust some of the information in this book that comes from sources that are protected for anonymity. Another caveat is that, unfortunately, I have not used any of my word count to talk about male strippers. The phenomenon of Magic Mike has placed male stripping in the public conversation, and to some extent has helped move the dialogue forwards, not least by reminding mainstream audiences that there are also men who work in the sex industry. Pointing out the existence of male sex workers is essential, since it serves to disrupt some of the most ingrained core beliefs about victimhood and abuse being gendered. For the purposes of writing this book, however, when I talk about strip clubs, I am talking about a female workforce. While male strippers also fall into the category of precarious workers, the business model is very different when it comes to butlers in the buff or male strippergrams. Male strippers work for a fixed wage, either a performance fee or a split of the profit depending on whether they work for a club, an agency, or take private bookings. As far as I know, there are no strip clubs where male strippers are paying house fees, fines and commissions and hustling to sell private dances. They are not starting from a deficit, having paid out a house fee to a venue which then takes a cut of everything they earn on top. They are not at a permanent disadvantage, fearful for their jobs. The working environments between genders are not comparable, so I have therefore chosen to leave them out. Of course, I would welcome a book written by a man that divulges the employment conditions, cultural biases, and forms of exploitation encountered by male strippers. I hear it's not a walk in the park either. Since I began my stripping career, SEV numbers in the UK have dwindled from 350 clubs a decade ago to 150 at present. Declining numbers of strip clubs may not sound like the most pressing issue at hand, but they are part of a wider picture. I started writing this book in 2019, 10 years after the passing of the Policing and Crime Act 2009, the current law that regulates SEVs. The law sets out to control strip clubs and protect women by cleaning up a fringe economy that has long been poorly managed. I began dancing on the club circuit in 2006, just a few years before the Policing and Crime Act 2009 was passed, and so have been able to observe conditions before, during and after. Present-day conditions in the industry 10 years on make a mockery of the idea that women have been protected. The law had a devastating effect on the industry and pushed those who work in it into ever-worsening working conditions. This book aims to explain those conditions from the point of view of a social architecture of public policy and enforcement that has failed to achieve its mission. Right now, sex workers are in crisis. Since the first draft of this book was completed, COVID-19 has devastated people's lives the world over. Precarious people have been made exponentially more precarious, and it's those who are closer to the bottom of the social ladder and most financially insecure who have been hit hardest. In the afterword, I give a more detailed update of how sex workers have been impacted and how club closures, loss of income, and ever-increasing levels of insecurity have led thousands of women to turn to different forms of sex work to survive. COVID-19 has revealed how badly strippers have been let down by their social architecture. One of the most egregious outcomes of the pandemic has been the extent to which club owners have benefited from the UK government furlough scheme. As part of a national economic crisis package, employers have been able to rely on bailout payments to pay their staff up to 80% of their salaries, while businesses have been under lockdown. In the case of strip clubs, this has meant all employed staff, bartenders, door security, managers, have been furloughed throughout the pandemic. Dancers, despite their integral role within the business, have been excluded from the furlough scheme, leaving them dependent on other forms of support, which for millions of self-employed precarious workers has been unreliable at best, and for undocumented workers, non-existent. Had public debate a decade ago not been couched in hysteria and ridicule, had dancers been properly included in the public and parliamentary discourse, had club bosses been compelled to establish a business model that wasn't run on the misclassification and financial exploitation of its workforce, had sex workers been able to access their labour rights and establish their employment protections, then perhaps we would be seeing very different outcomes today. The good news is that times are changing. If I've learned anything from over 15 years of stripping, it's that sex workers are a resilient bunch. Throughout the writing of this book, several momentous events took place, shifting the balance of power in favour of workers and changing the cultural landscape of the sex industry. Strippers have been engaging in trade union activism, making representations at local council meetings, demanding basic employment rights at work, and even, in some cases, campaigning to preserve licences when clubs have been under threat of closure in order to protect their own jobs. Landmark court cases have been fought and won by strippers, establishing once and for all that they do in fact have power in their workplaces, and that the conditions they are working under are often unlawful. As a result of community building and self-organisation, increasing numbers of sex workers and strippers have been turning away from the exploitative business owners running the clubs and setting up their own initiatives. Pop-up alternative events run by indie collectives, which challenge the stigma surrounding sex work, have been appearing more frequently as acts of resistance and statements of political protest. The future of the sex industry is worker-led. Big changes are on the way, and they are happening fast. Chapter 1. Ethical Stripping. Everything great in life and business is born out of good communication. Cindy Gallop. A major inspiration for writing this book is the work of Dossie Easton and Janet W. Hardy, writers of The Ethical Slut, first published in 1997. In their Practical Guide to Polyamory, Open Relationships and Other Adventures, Easton and Hardy offer an understanding of the complexities of non-traditional relationship models and provide a language for communicating outside of traditional heteronormative monogamy. They are quick to identify their choice of title and define its intended meaning. As proud sluts, we believe that sex and sexual love are fundamental forces for good, activities with the potential to strengthen intimate bonds, enhance lives, open spiritual awareness, and even change the world. Sluts share their sexuality the way philanthropists share their money, because they have a lot of it to share, because it makes them happy to share it, and because sharing makes the world a better place. Here, Easton and Hardy identify their sexuality as a form of value, and their sluttish nature as their desire to give that value away. Some strippers and sex workers do identify as people who have enough sexuality to share around, but the idea quickly becomes murky and laden with moral baggage in the context of an economic marketplace. Being an ethical slut sounds nice in theory, but what about if you're charging for it instead of sharing it freely? What's ethical about stripping if it comes at a price? How can selling sex be ethical? What does ethical stripper mean? Ethics and morals are often used interchangeably, though they don't mean the same thing. Morality, as used here, comes from the idea that we have an internal moral compass guiding us through life and pointing us towards good and away from evil. it refers to our individual sense of right and wrong. Morals are often seen as the foundation of our beliefs.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?